Good day. My name is Chuck Schuster, and I want to welcome you to this Change Maker program for the Roots Africa program. I am a retired extension educator from the University of Maryland and have had the opportunity to work with the Roots Africa program in Liberia and Uganda for the past year. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work in some fashion to help all of us have an opportunity to learn. So today I'm going to look at horticultural crops, looking at post-harvest losses and what we can do to prevent some of these. And we're also going to discuss a little bit on value-added products and how that can benefit us. We want to start out understanding what are we talking about with post-harvest losses. When we harvest a crop, when we have a crop ready to harvest, let's just talk tomatoes, peppers, onions, potatoes, okra. When we have a crop ready to harvest, if we don't harvest a portion of it because we don't have a market, that crop will then degrade and be lost. So it's lost income. When we harvest a crop and we damage the crop because of the way we package it, either in crates or baskets that are too rough or too large, if the transportation process damages it, if it sits out in the hot sun and gets sun scalded, these are examples of post-harvest losses. And then we always worry about the potential that the product that we harvested, the fruits or the vegetables, start to rot. So we want to look at what we can do to not lose quantity of product or quality of product, and then look at some of the income opportunities that we might take and utilize as we look at alternatives to selling just the raw vegetable or fruit. If I harvest a tree, if I cut a tree down and I let it lay there for a week, nothing really happens to the wood. But if I milk a cow or a goat or a lamb and I don't do something with that milk quickly and I leave it in the heat, the milk will start to go sour. So from very quickly to over a long period of time, things do break down. So we need to understand how we handle the horticultural products we grow, everything from cocoa to coffee, to bananas, to tomatoes and peppers and squashes, to onions and potatoes. We need to look at what we can do to preserve them so that we can get them to market and maintain the value that they're worth. So through a little bit of training, we can work with farmers and help them understand new ways that can help preserve the quality of the fruits and vegetables that they produce. This is very, very important to us, looking at some very simple things that we probably already know, but we need to rethink and put into place. So that's going to be the focus of where I'm going to speak today as I look at these potential for post-harvest losses. In doing a Google search and looking at what is going on with crop loss in sub-Saharan African countries, we look on the grain side that post-harvest losses amount to about $4 billion annually. That's every year. Now, it's not only the loss of dollars of income to the farmer, but it's also the fact that the grain, and this chart relates to cereal grains, it's also relating to the fact that there's food that could have fed up to 48 million people that was lost. So we want to look at everything we can do. Now, my focus is not on grain. My focus is on other crops, but some of the same ideas can be employed to look at grain also. So again, looking at some research that has been done, And let's just focus on the two ovals that I have, handling and storage and processing and packaging. So the green column is the column that we are going to focus on primarily right now. So we are losing between 5 and 10% of all vegetable crops through the handling. I picked it, I put it in a container, and then I stored it until it was ready to sell. So I'm losing between 5 and 10% of the crop. It's a fairly large amount. In the processing and packaging area, it's between 5 and 6%. Now let's come over here and let's look at consumption. We don't waste a lot of food in Africa after it gets to the consumer. Look at developed countries like the United States. Look at the amount of food that is wasted by the consumer after they have purchased it. We're approaching and surpassing 20% of the food they purchase gets thrown away because of improper care or not using it in a timely fashion. So we want to look at what we can do to reduce, especially in these two areas. So there are so many variables in this. Let's focus today on tomatoes. Just one simple crop, tomatoes, something that is grown around the world. Tomatoes, when they're ripe, have a shelf life. They're only going to last so long. We can lengthen this storage period through some methods, but we need to get it to the point where it can go to storage first. So we want to look at this idea of how we handle the tomato in the field and immediately out of the field. Traditionally, we use large wooden boxes. Very often the wood is rough sawn, or we're going to be using jute type baskets, sometimes very large jute type baskets. And we see that in the case of quantity loss, the total amount we're able to harvest and get to storage, that's anywhere from 23% to 48% loss. And the quality of the product that we harvested can be decreased by up to 17% simply through bruising and skin damage. And by the way, bruising and skin damage then opens the pathway for pathogens to attack and increase the potential for rots to occur. By going to appropriately sized crates or baskets, we like plastic because plastic can be sanitized. When I have a wooden basket, if it is exposed to a foodborne pathogen, E. coli, salmonella, things like that, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to really sanitize that. So we pass the pathogen then to the consumer. When we look at plastic, we can sanitize the plastic crates. Most importantly, though, whatever your material, having an appropriate sized storage container is very, very important. We can then reduce quantity losses. Notice up here, we were at 23%. We can reduce it to a maximum of 17%, and we can reduce quality down to 6.9. We'll just say 7% down from 17. So a decrease. We've improved by 10%. Now, whatever we do, getting the heat, the warmth out of the crop after we harvest it can also be a great aid. Doing something like post-harvest cooling, simply not pushing our baskets, our crates tight together so air can circulate around them. Something as simple as that can improve both quantity and quality of our tomatoes over time. Now, that's not going to be an immediate loss, but that's going to be over the next 1 to 7 days and possibly longer. Removal of field heat. You're out in the field, you're picking in the hot sun. The tomatoes are warm, whatever the average temperature of the day is. whether that be 20 to 30 degrees Celsius, it doesn't really matter. They're warm. That tomato, that fruiting part of the plant, is a respiring, it has cells that are living. So we want to preserve these cells for the longest period of time. So anything we can do that's going to help reduce that warmth, including putting them in the shade, that's going to be a big help. Because if we don't get some of the warmth out of the product, then the natural decaying process starts to take over. Fungi like warm, damp things. So if I can cool my tomato down, even by 5 degrees Celsius, I've benefited. So we look at pre-cooling in a way that helps lessen or decrease microbial activity. Microbes exist everywhere. The soil is alive with it. The plant itself is alive with microbial activity. But once I harvest the tomato, the squash, the pepper, the potato, the onion, I need to do things that are going to slow that microbial activity, the degrading of the crop. I want to slow the respiration process. Remember, that tomato is still alive with cellular activity. So it is going through a respiration, much like you and I breathe. That tomato isn't dead at that point in time. Tomatoes that are kept tightly together in a warm environment produce a chemical called ethylene, which increases or enhances ripening. Well, if I harvest a crop slightly prior to peak time for harvest, and I stack them too closely together, then the ethylene will cause them to ripen to the point of possibly being overly ripe. So if I space them out, allow the ethylene process to slow down, I can decrease the process of ripening and thus preserve the crop for a longer period of time. Now, pre-cooling doesn't have to be expensive, but one of the things that pre-cooling does use is water. So where water is a problem, pre-cooling typically doesn't occur. We can simply dip the tomatoes in water. We can add a bleach product, sodium hypochlorite. We can add fungicides. This will slow the microbial action that's occurring on the crop. Not only am I reducing the warmth of the crop, so it's going to last longer, but I'm also reducing the microbial load that's on the surface of that crop. Unfortunately, this process, because of the lack of high quality water throughout many regions in Africa, at the time in which we're harvesting, decreases the use of this tool. So if we were to utilize this, I could use a 5 to 10% sodium hypochlorite solution mixed with water. And it's going to reduce some of the potential of foodborne pathogens that are sitting on the surface. Now, remember, harvester and handler hygiene is very, very important. We ourselves can carry pathogens on our skin that in the handling of the product could then contaminate the product, and then that contamination would be passed on to consumers, and in some cases causing them to be ill. So we always want to be aware of that potential. So again, bleach, something as simple as bleach, readily available in most areas, has been utilized for a long period of time and does fit into the good agricultural practices category of a method of reducing fungal activity. We can use fungicides. Dipping tomato fruits in a fungicide solution will also be beneficial. Again, in both cases, I need a quantity of water to do this. Now, water is typically going to be cooler than the ambient temperature, the air temperature around the tomatoes. After I have dipped them, washed them, whatever I'm going to do this process, then I need to make sure that the tomatoes back in their containers are spaced widely apart so that air can circulate around them and the tomatoes can then dry out. So this air circulation mentioned here is very important. The way we transport our fruit and our vegetables is critical. Moving delicate products like tomatoes and squash can lead to a good crop, or it can damage the crop. You know, you look at a crate right here, and there's the bottom. Imagine the weight of the tomatoes on the top and how much pressure they put on the bottom. With really ripe tomatoes, this could lead to bruising and potentially to crushing. So I've lost volume of tomatoes that are marketable, and other tomatoes I could have also lost quality of them. Going to smaller containers and then having layers of them with something that separates them is very useful. So proper packaging, selecting the appropriate size container, not bringing tomatoes out of the field in baskets and then dumping them on the ground to go back in and harvest in that same basket again. Things like that lead to quality and quantity loss. Having enough appropriate size containers so that we can harvest and then leave them in the container so that we're not handling them more often than necessary is very, very useful. Using things about a half a bushel, maybe 3/4 of a bushel, are adequate to protect the tomatoes themselves, peppers themselves. So even these large baskets are somewhat too large, especially when you think about the tomatoes on the bottom. There's going to be a potential, if these tomatoes are very ripe, that we're going to damage them. So smaller baskets, but even looking beyond that, let's look at, we brought them out of the field. How long will they be stored in this setting? Are they going to sit there for an hour? Are they going to sit there for 12 hours? Are they going to sit there for 24 hours? What's the next step? So what can we do to preserve the quality of the tomatoes, the fruits, the vegetables, after we get them to this point, out of the field, but before they get to the consumer? Looking at harvesting time is real important. Can I harvest a few days early? The tomatoes are a little firmer. The peppers are a little firmer. By doing that, I then prevent a lot of the bruising from occurring. Have good, clean baskets or crates. That's real important. As we look at considering the use of dung, manures, composts, as nutrient sources, we have to recognize that they do bring the potential of some foodborne pathogens. So when we set a basket on the ground and it touches something that could potentially contaminate it, and then we stick this basket inside of another basket, we've now contaminated the inside of that second basket. So if we have baskets and crates that can be cleaned, this decreases that risk. Again, air circulation as the plant, as the fruits sit in storage is important. The fruits, the vegetables, they generate heat as part of the respiration process. So by providing a little bit of room around them so that that heat can escape, that is very useful. Getting them out of the sun is also extremely useful. So when possible, consider constructing a shade structure. Something as simple as this, so I can store my tomatoes underneath this, and that keeps the sun off of them for long periods of time. That's going to prevent the top of the baskets from being sun scalded. Tomatoes and peppers can be stored for a short period of time, up to 7 days, without a lot of concern. Get them out of the sun, the normal air temperature, provided with some ventilation, and we're not going to see too great a loss. If I want to store them longer than this 5 to 7 day period, I want to look at some ideas of doing a little bit of cooling. Now, cooling often is looked upon refrigerated type cooling, electricity, or some other energy source that will generate the cooling process. We do have the ability of using evaporative cooling, which uses either jute sacks or charcoal walls so that we pour water across it, and then as air flows through it, it reduces some of the warmth. So we utilize evaporative cooling in the mid-Atlantic states where I live, where we see highs of 95 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit and higher humidities at times. And we will use evaporative cooling in chicken houses so that the chickens will stay cool enough so that they continue to grow well, as one example. Charcoal coolers, utilizing a wire wall 4 to 6 inches wide, filled with charcoal. And then we build walls, we build a structure, and then we pour water across it. We can see cooling temperatures come out of this, which will then preserve the quality of our crop for a much longer time than if they were just in the shade without any evaporative cooling. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. So we built a structure, we put wire on it. In the side, the wall, between the wire, we have placed charcoal, small pieces of charcoal. Charcoal is very porous. We can spray it down or pour water across it and put our crop inside, close the door, and we will see an improvement in the quality of the crop over a longer period of time. So we can use some of these same concepts in storing things like peppers and squash. Onions, we like to get them out of the field. We will store them elevated or on a wire rack out of the sun so they can start, the skins can start to dry down. We space them apart wide enough so that air circulates around them. We can make things last a lot longer with a little bit of thought process around trying to prevent microbial action from occurring. Onions packed too tightly together can rot just like anything else. You know, we think about crops like cocoa and bananas. Getting them out of the sun after harvesting is also very, very useful. When we start to think about storage, think about a storage structure that can be cleaned. If I've got a small shade type area and I'm going to store tomatoes in it, but yet a basket starts to see some tomatoes rot, after I remove these tomatoes from in that area, I want to clean that area up. Because if I leave the residue of rotting tomatoes, the microbes that are feeding that will then have access to the next crop that comes in. Remember, airflow is very, very important. Again, airflow does not have to be an electric fan. It can simply be open air where the sides, there are no sides and air can move through that. Now, if refrigeration is available, that takes electricity. That takes a refrigeration unit. So in larger scale areas, we might have the benefit of that. Try to prevent a harvested group of tomatoes that was harvested 3 days ago being mixed with a harvested group of tomatoes that was picked today. Make sure that I know which ones are older so that I can cycle them out, get them to the next stage of either value added or to the consumer before I start to move the tomatoes that were picked just today. We produce a lot of crop, and sometimes consumers aren't ready for the crop in its raw form. And when we look at some of the potentials that we have across Africa, we look at the fact that we tend to move our cocoa in a raw form to other countries and let other countries do the processing. So we sell it in the raw form at a wholesale price. Another group then takes it and processes it. So they have invested money in it, and they then are able to raise the price and make more money out of the same crop. Now it has been modified. It has been value added. So I've made it into a chocolate per se. So we look at things that we can do that are going to help us get to that point. So what areas can we look at that are going to help us? You know, we look at some very simple byproducts in agriculture. We look at animal waste. We look at plant waste. But yet we have learned that we can take much of this material and we can compost it. We can produce a nutrient that is then plant available. We can then apply it to the plants when they need it. Then the plant's going to grow better. So we've taken a raw waste product, animal manure, leftover corn, leftover whatever plant, tomato crop. We could compost it down and we're going to gain something by it. So we did a value added to it. Now, compost, when it's done well, reduces the pathogen load. Raw manure has the potential of carrying with it E. coli or salmonella, depending upon the animal it's from. So we always want to consider utilizing these products in a way that they're going to benefit us, but also it's not going to present a potential, a problem with other pathogens being transferred to our customers or possibly even to ourselves. So the process of composting, when it's done well, monitoring the temperature, when the temperature starts to decline, turning the pile again until it no longer cools or no longer heats up, we can then kill a lot of the pathogens that would live in some of this material. Ask your customer, what do they want in the way of an end product? Yes, tomatoes are great, peppers are great, but are there other ways they might want them? You know, I talked about the cocoa. We can take the cocoa and we can produce it into, you know, products that come from that, including chocolate or other byproducts. You know, we look at some of the cereal grains and what can we do, like with soybeans? We could extract the oil, sell the oil, and then we have the leftover product, soybean oil meal, which is a livestock feed additive for protein. What about some of the other vegetables we have? What can we do that we can then preserve, like cucumbers? Could we make pickles? Tomatoes, could we can tomatoes? Are there things that we could do that would increase the value of the crop over the raw commodity itself? But we need to know what the customer wants. Where do we intend for the product to go? Then what can we do? And then we need to know how to do it and do it well. Now, some of this takes energy, heat. Some of it takes some specialized equipment. But can we look at doing this and benefiting the end consumer because they're getting a product that will store longer periods of time, like a pickle versus a cucumber? And can I then increase the value that's going to come back to the farmer? So we don't want to look at the value of agriculture only looking at the value of the raw commodity they produce. Some of the value coming back to the farmer is in that way. But other value can be gained by modifying the raw product into a finished product. Liberia is known for its rubber and latex production, but yet they don't do anything with it in the way of making products out of it, which would make it much more valuable to the end consumer. So that's just one simple answer that we could create jobs, but also make more money that's going to stay locally rather than exporting the latex, the rubber product, the raw material, and letting someone else make something out of it and mark the value up to a much higher extent. So, when we consider what we can do, we can look at things like cotton. Are we going to sell it in a raw form, or can we refine that and make clothing out of it? We've already talked about cocoa. We've talked about rubber products. Fruits. Would we consider getting a dehydrator and using a solar dehydrator and drying fruits so that I would have a dry product that is storable for much longer periods of time than the raw product? We look at cereal grains and rice and how we can modify these and make better uses of them so that we are not just selling the raw grain, which we are then stuck getting paid what the market will bear. If we can take wheat as an example and produce flour and then sell the flour into the community so that individuals don't have to make their own. In the area of vegetables, we have the ability of doing value added to vegetables. Think of the number of canned or preserved vegetables that can be made and that will extend the saleability of that product long after the vegetable is no longer in the field to be harvested. So things that we can think about that are going to help us. Don't jump into this in too big of a fashion, whether it be looking at post-harvest losses or value added. Start looking at doing it a little at a time. We know that the consumer wants a tomato that isn't bruised or torn. So consider the way we harvest it, the type of container we put it in, the size of container. Think about doing value added. What types of things can we do? What would the consumer want? Now, what does it take to do that? Start something on small scale. Prove that it works. Start to develop your market. Your market develops, you sell a little bit, you gain some money, you put that money back into it, and then grow that process. I end with this photo. We look at the potential of post-harvest losses in grains alone from rodents. Well, by elevating this and then by putting rodent collars on all the posts, that's a very simple idea. It takes money to do, but this structure could last a very, very long time. So we're going to reduce a lot of the risk factors for loss of the grain. And in some studies, it shows that we're losing 40 to 50% of grain post-harvest over a period of 6 to 8 months. So ideas that we can think about. Let's start a conversation. You are the change makers. Let's see how we can make this work together. I look forward to seeing you again. If you have questions, never hesitate to reach out and follow up with ideas. Let's see where we can take this. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you again.